So want to pick up today where we left off last time, which was on Pogge's argument, and then go into Altman and Wellman. It's not much to tie up with Pogge. We got most of it done. About the exam, by the way, there was an odd thing going on. Like there was this was by far the most. The distribution was. Is it binomials the way? Anyway, it was extreme on both ends. So some people, like usually you get sort of a normal distribution, like many people in the middle, some really good, some not so good. This time it was sort of the middle. There was no middle. But there were a lot more people really, really good than normal, and then there were a lot more people who were really lower than normal. So I don't know what's going on. But if you're on the good side, then keep going. But if you're on the lower end and you want to talk about it and see what went wrong, then let me know. We should get, hopefully, the good people on the good side and then move that lower end to the middle, and then we have a really, really nice distribution. Anyway, so that's that. I'll post the exam on Canvas again, like always, and the correct answers as well. I'll do that today. And then you can look at least your multiple choice questions. And if there's anything you want to talk about, let me know. All right. So about Pogge. So if you remember, Pogge and Singer both do. They both defend a view of international justice when they're talking about international distributive justice. So economic advantage, wealth, money, opportunities, things like that. And they talk about it in a way that is a challenge to what is the standard way in which we think about it. The standard way being mainly questions of economic inequality and so on. Insofar as they matter at all, they matter only within the borders of a country. Then there might be some charitable obligations that we have to donate to things like disaster relief or like some basic humanitarian aid. But as you know, these things from the news, like the budget we spend on that is very, very small compared to the enormous amounts of resources we spend on, at least by comparison, on fighting domestic inequality or domestic poverty. So we subsidize higher education for you, right? If I'm not mistaken, to the tune of about $6,000 a year a student. North Carolina subsidizes your education here. So that might be a good idea, it might be a bad idea, but if Pogge and Singer are to be believed, if your reason for doing so is that we should make sure that poor people in the state have opportunities to further themselves, well, that's a mistake, right? Or at least if you want to do that, then you should be spending at least as much, probably much, much more on poor people outside of the state, outside of this country, to try and further themselves as well. So we're looking at these are the arguments they give for why that old distinction of like look within your borders first, and then there's sort of an afterthought of international inequality. Why that is a mistake, I think. And Altman and Wellman, you see, they actually defend that traditional thought. They think a version of that traditional thought can be acceptable. Not quite the standard view that we have on a day-to-day basis, but something like it. All right. So Singer, right? You remember it was a straightforward argument. He says, look, you should save people if you can from dying, at least unless it costs you a lot. Right? And guess what? You can do this pretty much every day, and it takes quite a lot of giving before it starts costing us too much. So go and do it. That's basically the argument. Right? Now, Pogge gives a similar argument for why we shouldn't be thinking about justice or inequality as primarily a domestic or national event or problem, but a global issue. And his argument doesn't rely on anything like this positive duty to aid or requirement to assist people who are dying. His argument is one of non-harming, right? So first, do no harm. So it's an argument of non-interference, if you will. So it's not that we should think about global inequality as really important because we owe it to people abroad to make them better off. He thinks probably that you do, but even if you don't, he says, actually the world is not one in which if we don't do anything, we're just not helping these people. He thinks we're actively harming those people. And so he thinks the reason to care about global inequality is that you should stop, bless you, you should stop harming people. Unless they're terrible people who deserve it or something, but that's of course not what we're dealing with. So if you remember, he has a couple of, I should go back actually, a couple of moral premises, right? It's about the coercive order. If you impose it, you need a justification. And then he says that's actually the one that we're living under is the global economic order. It's imposed by a small minority on a large majority, and it puts the large majority in avoidable, life-threatening poverty. He says if you do those things, like if you do that kind of thing, that's the combination of these moral claims here, then you better have a good argument. And if this is the way in which it plays out, the small minority is putting a large amount of people in threat of its life, literally, then it's unjust. I think that's a very low bar to jump over, right? Like it's many highly unequal kinds of worlds might still satisfy this, but ours does not, he thinks. Okay, ours does not. Okay, so that's the descriptive premise, right? Well, here we talked about this. This is the first, well, the global economic order exists and it really impacts you. So he says international law is the form that this takes. We have all these treaties about the national resource and borrowing privileges. So you have international law allows countries to sell off the natural resources, diamonds, oil, copper, whatever, right? And take out loans in the name of the country. So the government of whatever sovereign nation can take out a loan internationally against, not in their own person, but again, like not if you're the president, you don't take out the loan in your own name, right? You have a couple of $1 billion mortgage going on. No, the country has that, right? And so these people then, when they leave power, they don't take the loan with them. The loan stays attached to the country, right? And often what they do is they line their pockets with parts of that loan, and so they scurry off with the money if the people in the pocket, and now the people through the taxes have to pay off the loan. So that's a way in which countries can be impoverished, he thinks, and that's a feature, it's a product of international law. And that's this global economic order. For next time, we'll look at a further claim. He talks about intellectual property rights, in particular patents on medicine. So that's just saying it impacts people. And then here's the final empirical claim, which is that thing, those rules, right? So the resource privilege, the borrowing privilege, the intellectual property rights, the patents, they are imposed by a small minority on the rest of the world, and it puts those people in avoidable life-threatening poverty. So basically his idea is the West puts this on the rest of the world. And as a result of this, the rest of the world is dying where they could be saved. Or could be not put in that position anyway. Lots of people who worry about Pogge's argument, by the way, this is one of the parts where they start getting worried. And if they don't get worried about this, sometimes they get worried about his own positive proposals to come up with a better system. But anyway, here's how he defends it, right? So it's imposed by a small minority on a large majority and puts those people in avoidable life-threatening poverty. Why? Well, he thinks international law is the product of international negotiations, right? Governments, you have these G7 or whatever, some number summits. They come up, they sit together in some plush resort, and then ta-da, here are the rules, right? And then what are the countries, what are these G countries? Well, it's mostly the Western countries. China is now involved often as well, right? And so, but it's a couple of big countries, and they really are the ones that set the rules. Countries that are really, really poor, they don't have much power internationally, and so they don't really carry much sway at these international negotiations. So Pogge says, and this thing is vibrating like crazy again. Anyway. So that's the small minority imposing it on a large majority. So the explanation of that is, right, like, so you have a country just being a state under the Montevideo Convention, we saw this earlier in the term, just means having a stable population, a territory, a government, and an ability to engage in treaties. That's a very low bar. It has no moral component, no justification component, no human rights component, nothing to it, right? And so what that means is that anyone who qualifies as such no matter how democratic they might be, no matter how atrociously oppressive they might be, they're going to qualify as a country and therefore have these privileges. Privileges like the borrowing privilege and the resource privilege. And because they have these, you get bad regimes in place. That's the empirical claim here. Right? You get bad regimes in place because a country finds oil. Good news, right? We have oil. Actually, often that means bad news in practice, because it means you get a lot of violence to go with it. Violence over who controls the oil. Why is there violence over who controls the oil? Well, whoever controls it can use this resource privilege and start selling off billions of dollars worth of drilling permits and so on. And in corrupt countries, or poor countries, unstable countries, those billions of dollars don't go to the people. In principle, you could do that, right? So in places like Alaska, they do. In Norway, they do. But when you're in Sierra Leone, for example, they don't. They go to whoever is in power and his buddies that he needs to pay off. Right? So the military and the politicians were some favorite class. So there you have it. Right? You stop doing. So his argument is we should care about what is going on in countries like Sierra Leone, not because we owe people who need saving our money. Maybe we do, but even if we don't, we are actively contributing to an international system that is putting these people in poverty, because it's creating this instability and violence. And so on. All right. So that's roughly the argument, right? So it's a harm-based argument. Stop harming is basically the point. All right. So here's a couple of worries. So here's the first objection. This is one he actually discusses, right? So he's saying, well, maybe, hey, Poggi, you're saying we should really think about inequality as a global issue, not a domestic issue. But maybe there are just different standards that apply within a country and internationally. That's the standard view, right? So internationally, inequality doesn't matter nearly as much as it matters domestically. That's why we spend a lot of money on higher education, on financial aid for people's medical services, on retirement benefits, on this, that, and the other thing. Right? But we don't do nearly as much internationally. All right, so Poggi says, well, we can sidestep this in some way, but he points out that he's only insisting on the minimal standard. Right? Only this thing that if the small minority does it to the large majority and the large majority is dying, then it's unjust. He says, well, no matter, even if you think that he actually rejects this, he thinks there is no difference between these different standards. This is a nationalist view that he finds unacceptable. But even if you disagree with this, even if you hold something like Altman and Wellman's view, who do think there's different standards, then that low bar of just don't threaten the lives of large swaths of people around the world, that's something that surely has to be part of whatever good standard is going to be internationally. Even if you think domestically more is required, which it doesn't, but then you should still accept the bar that he's setting because it's such a low bar. So that's a pretty good answer, probably. But philosophically, there's an interesting question still here, right? Like, in his heart of hearts, he thinks, he's written about this, right? Internationally, we should have, the same standard of justice should apply across the world. Not different within a certain country and another country, just the same across the world. And that's the thing that Altman and Wellman think is ultimately mistaken. All right, so that's a small one. He addresses that one. So here is there's another objection. This is a little more probing. So lots of people who've worried about Poggi say the empirical claims he's making are wrong. So if you remember, right, the statement is the West is actively harming the world's poor, the developing nations. How? Well, by imposing these laws on them. Right? That's what makes these poor countries poor. And one standard objection to this is saying, well, actually, that's not like if we look at what's causing the trouble in African countries that are war-torn and so on, like Congo or Sierra Leone. It's not the U.S. doing. It's not the European Union that's doing that. It's the crooks over there. They're the ones actually doing the killing. They're the ones actually taking the bribes. They should cut, one person is killing another person. You said, you stop doing that. Right? That's the obvious answer. It's not the U.S. who is at miles and miles and miles away and maybe has created some international legal rules. They are there, the international legal rules, but it's still, there's a person killing another person, just stop it. Like that's the problem. This is too convoluted, basically, is the idea. Another version of the argument is an empirical claim, that people say, well, the sources of inequality, if you really analyze what the problem is, like why is a country poor, it's not because of international law, but it's because its domestic economic institutions are crappy. So there is no rule of law, right? Or there are no stable property rights, or people are being randomly imprisoned or something, right? Stuff like that. So that's really what's going on. It's not international law that's doing it. It's the domestic laws that are doing it. If that's true, then the argument breaks down, right? Because Pogge is relying on a causal story. Right? It's the international law, that's the part that we're creating, the West, that's actually making countries poor. If that's not true, then we're not actually harming them, and then his argument that inequality globally should be fought by us because we're harming people, well, you can't make that argument anymore. All right, so here's his response. He thinks, yeah, these are bad people. The murderers are murderers, and they should stop it yesterday. But he says that doesn't mean that we are not contributing at all. Right? So even if 99% of the problem is these horrible people doing horrible things, there's still a further question about how come we live in a world where those people get to take the power and do the horrible things? Are we contributing to those people being in power in a way that we can foresee? If so, then we should stop that part. So it's true that most of the problem he thinks is there. Most of the problem are these Mugabes and so on. These are the worst, right? Literally. But that doesn't mean we're off the hook. If we had some type of even a small contribution to someone like him being empowered, then that part is the part that we are doing, and that's the part that we're responsible for. He says, that's the one I'm talking about. Right? All right. The question you should ask yourself, of course, if we're now reducing the story to a small section of the problem, he still wants it to be a pretty radical thesis, right? He thinks there should be a fairly strong redistributive policy internationally. So it should be, people in the West should be taxed, and we should send money to the third world to try and help these countries do better because of this causal story that he's telling. Of course, if we start shrinking the causal impact that we're having, the question is, can you still, on that smaller causal story, support these redistributive policies? Anyway, it's one thing for you to think about. So here's a third possible objection. This is one that Pogge doesn't discuss. This is a philosophical one, not so much a practical one. What if we just dismantle international law? Right? What if we said, all right, Pogge, you're right. It's international law that is contributing to these countries being in poverty and in chaos. So let's just stop the game. We just stop the whole game. Anything goes. There is no international law anymore. No human rights. No anti-aggression law. We just dismantle the whole thing. So then we are not harming them anymore, right? Because we're not imposing anything. It's not clear. This is a weird thing, right? So it's not clear what he could say. Because he's saying, well, we're harming them. That's the problem. Well, so let's remove the harm. We'll just, no more international law. Then he doesn't seem to have an argument left anymore. Yeah, right?
I think he probably maybe could respond in the way of saying, well, that's an absurdity to take away all of the international law. You would just want to take away the parts just relevant to the countries struggling. That would be a pretty easy response by him.
But even if we did, I mean, the point I'm trying to make is, the argument starts by pointing out that we're interacting with these people, right? So, and we owe them certain things because of justice, because of the interaction we're having. The interaction is bad, he says. It's a harmful interaction. And that's the thing that causes the redistributive claims. Now then one answer is say, well, let's make sure that we interact with them in a better way. That's his view. Right? Another way would say, let's not interact with these people anymore. The point I'm trying to make with that is saying, well, if it follows logically from the argument that the claims of justice disappear if there is no interaction anymore, right? Because the claims of justice required interaction. Now, if that seems weird to you, right, then there's something weird about saying that claims of justice require interaction. Right? Then maybe Singer was right after all. Maybe something like Singer would be right after all. That even if we didn't interact, well, there's still these people are really poor, and that's something that we should care about. Right? And if that's true, then this thing may be a red herring, right? Like he talks about this whole, and maybe there's harmful stuff. Okay, this is not an argument for it's okay to harm people. However, it is an argument for like if the harm thing that he's pointing to may not really be what matters for justice internationally. Because if we remove the interaction and thereby remove the harm, it seems that international justice still remains as alive as an issue. And if that's true, then you need a theory about that thing, right? Because that's what we're talking about. Tamir?
So in your example, the interaction is international law.
Right.
So if they took that away, I feel like you could still interact. You just, you could literally do whatever you want. Like there's no discipline to it. You do whatever.
Yeah, I mean, at the very least, Poggi would have. So Poggi says, "Hey, you and me and everyone here, right? But hey, you can be taxed for the benefit of people in the third world. Why? Like, why are you taking my money? Well, because you're a citizen of the United States, and the United States is the one that's creating this international law that is harming them, and so you're complicit in this harm. That's the story. It's on you, just as much as on me and on everybody else here, right?" Now let's cut out the harm. Right? Just cut out the harm. Well, that story doesn't fly anymore. So now you say, okay, well, there's bad people there, murdering other bad people. Sad, very sad. But why should I be taxed for this? The old story was, well, because you're complicit in, but you're not, right? We've just abolished the whole system. Of course, bad things will still happen, but that's the whole point, right? If the bad things are still happening, and that's an issue that we should care about, then the truth about why we should care about these bad things happening has nothing to do with our interaction with them. It has to do with the badness of the things happening. So, of course, there's an additional layer, right? Right now we have bad things happening which we should care about, and then possibly, if he's right, we are being complicit in the badness, and that's an additional layer, right? So, in that sense, it would be better. But if he's giving us a theory of justice about international affairs, he's saying, look, they're different. The domestic and the global is a mistake. It should just be global all the way. Right? It's a theory of international justice. Well, that thing we can get rid of by just getting rid of international law. And that's a weird implication. Anyway, that was the thought. Yeah. All right. So, just to summarize, what he thinks ultimately is because we're interacting with these people in harmful ways, we should revise international law. And that means it requires an institutional response. So it's not just like Singer, right? In the sense that the main first thing that you should do when faced with global poverty is a personal response, right? It's like, what can I do? Send money or save a person. Poggi says, no, there is this institutional framework, and it's a harmful one, and to fix the problem of international justice means giving it an institutional response, building a framework that's better. All right, so that's one. It's different from Singer in that way. So the other difference was he gives a harm-based and not a benefit-based argument. Right, so here's the other point. He thinks you and I can be taxed, right, to undo these global inequalities. Contrary to what's thought today, right? And it's because we as citizens help determine the international law. We create this institutional framework. Note, by the way, that there's another. If you're looking for ways to get out of the argument, I'm not saying you should, but if you're looking philosophically, like what's a questionable move, there is a further move just added, right? That I just slipped in here, which is if international law is actively harming poor people in the world, He's now saying that you, as a citizen of these countries that create international law, are complicit. Right? Like, so you and I are responsible. Why? Well, maybe because you vote. Well, what if you don't vote? Right? So, some story will need to be told. Maybe many people believe some story, but you need another story, right? There's an extra step going on here. Right. Forget about these questions for a moment. You can think about those when you before I move on, do you have any questions that I can answer about POGI so far? Otherwise, I'm going to go. Yeah, see.
So he wants, what I got from the whole lesson is that POGI thinks international law should be reformed.
Yes.
Because it's basically like the global economic order, right?
Yes, exactly, yeah.
That's that creates third world countries, like it's making them suffer. That's all I got.
Yeah, so, well, it contributes to the poverty in third world countries. Mm-hmm. So he thinks there's an international order that is created out of legal rules. And these legal rules are directly harmful to people in the third world. And because of that, he thinks there's an actual harm-based, it's like kicking a person who's already down, right? So that's what we're doing, he says. And so, because that's what we're doing, we can be required to pay for, for helping them get better. That's the rough outline of the argument. Anyone else? Yeah, Timur.
So in that analogy, kicking someone while they're down, is he asking us to kick them with less force, or to extend our hand and help them?
I'm not sure what they're. I mean, first of all, you got to stop kicking, right? But you do raise a decent point. I mean, he does seem to think that you should also give him a hand and help them up again. Basically, being like you also should assist them in developing. Right? Now the question is why should we assist them in developing rather than stop kicking? Is it to repay them for the kicking of yesterday? Right? Is it a reparations type argument? I mean, that's fair enough, right? Like if you actually caused harm, then we should compensate them and make them whole. Maybe you should be punished for the kicking. I mean, these are good questions, right? But that's not quite what he's saying, right? He's saying we should have this ongoing redistributive scheme, right? There's a standing tax on the West to keep helping people in poorer countries. And so that's not clear where that claim comes from. If it's just you're actually harming them, well then the proper response seems to be stop harming them and compensate them for the harm that you did. It might require a lot, right? That's not trivial business, right? I mean, it's reforming international law, and it probably means billions of dollars of reparations being sent to the third world. Right? That's a huge deal to make good on past injustices. It's not a small thing. But he wants more, right? He wants an ongoing, and he doesn't describe it as a reparations thing. He thinks this is just this redistributive scheme that we owe them, and it's not clear where that's coming from. All right. Anyone else?
So the money that he would be taxed would go to the poor, or would it go toward, reform the global economic order? Would it go toward, I don't know what word it was, like that? Like if we're reforming that, so that whatnot?
Yeah, that's a great question. So try and word the fact. I mean, it's telling that you're having trouble wording it. So try what's the alternative?
Like by reforming the global economic order, we would be getting less from. We wouldn't be getting as much resources and money and stuff from other countries. So would we be getting the money from? I don't know.
So you'd be taxed, right? And I would be taxed, right? So there's money that's being raised.
Right. And is that
Any
going
questions?
to go to the third world countries or whatever?
Yeah. So it's not. He doesn't really say, right? This is something slightly annoying, I guess, that philosophers sometimes do. So and then we'll solve that one, right? That's sort of how he plays it. One thing that you should worry about if you think this all the way through is some organization or institution is going to be in charge of dispersing this. So maybe the UN or something. Okay, well, the problem he sets up, right, is a problem of like, well, if you give a lot of money if you promise a government that as soon as it's a government, it's going to get a lot of money, that's a dangerous thing to do. That's the resource and borrowing privilege point. So can he come up with an alternative system, an institution, the UN in this case, that will start sitting on a pot of billions and billions of dollars, which is what it will be, in a way that is safe? Or will the same things start happening, maybe in a different way or maybe at a different scale, but still bad things start happening at that level again? And he should have said, I agree with you, he should have said something about that. He doesn't. So if you want to make an in principle argument about, well, this is a rights violation of people, then that's one thing, right? But he wants to make it a rights violation with a strong institutional dimension to it, right? He says, like, this is international law and so on, and because of the way the international law in practice works, actual harm is being done. Well, okay, but then we have to really think through the international law and institutions part of it, and that's going to be a big issue. Maybe it can be done, right? We know of a number of governments that sit on enormous amounts of resources that don't turn into predatory, abusive governments, including our own. But we also know of many, many others that do. Do you trust the UN? I don't. So then who, right? Can we set it up in such a way that we know that once we put billions and billions of dollars in play, that it'll be robust, like it'll be protected against it? I mean, that's a major issue. Even when we have your alternative, right? Like, is it going to go directly to the poor people? How? Like, how is it? So the U.S. government has now raised this tax, so it's sitting somewhere in the treasury. Then what? Like, send a check to who? Like, where's this check going to get? Like, we need addresses of people. What's the mailman going to do if he knows that all these letters with American stamps on it contain checks for all these people? Right? It's not that easy to get the money to the poor people. Like, you need an organization in charge that actually makes right. So, and now that same issue starts playing out. Right. Anyone else?
How does taxing Western countries, rich countries, that doesn't really change history. It doesn't change the crazy borders that were made. It doesn't change the
violence. Yeah.
Yeah, and everything that's resulted from whatever colonialization or any kind of imperialism that's going on. Somebody living in Malawi is not just gonna. They might like some money, but that doesn't really help them out of anything. It kind of creates dependency on. It screws them over even more. It creates dependency on the West to give them money. And we already have institutions in place that are supposed to help develop underdeveloped countries, like the World Bank or something like that. So how would this differ from that?
Yeah, good. And even so you might make this point in two ways, right? So you might say, well, the situation is already messed up because of the past. And because the situation is messed up, just starting pouring money in a messed up situation isn't going to do much, because the very thing that's causing the problem, which is these people are vulnerable to powerful warlords or dictators and so on, that very fact is going to just make sure that if you start pouring money into it, it won't solve the problem. It'll just be siphoned off by these same people, right? It's just a bigger price for them to capture. So that's one way to make a point. You could say, like, the problem there is in part that the bad institutions are there and these people are vulnerable to exploitation. And so you put a lot of money in it, in a bad situation where people are vulnerable for exploitation, they are going to get exploited again. Right?
Yeah.
So that's one version. The other version of the point that you might make is, even if that's not true, even if they would actually become better off, develop, to a prosperous, independent economy and so on. There's still a further issue, right? Which is, so let's say that we grant everything to POGI, right? You say, well, okay, we have to have this ongoing influx of money, tax on us, distributed there, so that now they're doing better. Right? Then there's still this major issue but then there's also the harm of yesterday, right? Or like last century or whatever. It's longer than that, right? And we haven't actually started addressing that yet, because this argument is supposed to. It starts from today's harm. It's the harm that international law is doing right now.
Right.
So, okay, maybe it does a harm, but then there's still the further issues. Let's say that we solve that one. There's still the further issue of centuries of oppression, civil war, in colonialization, and so on. Right? And so he hasn't said anything about that. So that would add an additional, if you think that that's something that needs to be made good on, then that would add an additional layer.
Yeah, unless you just want to forget that generation, we'll start with this one, you know what I mean? That's kind of what you have to do if you don't make up for, everything that's already happened.
Right, yeah. Of course, it's pretty difficult to outrun history that way. But
right, yeah.
Lots of people think. I mean, that might be easier to say if you're the descendant of a generation that caused the harms than a descendant of the generation that received the harms.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, Anthony?
Like if a country's like suffering, like where you just pump money into that country, then like I'm not sure if one if that would cause inflation if you just started giving them money, but then that money has to be backed by something like gold. So you can't just give money to the people that are starving. Like your government's going to have to pass gold over to the government, or like pass the resources over. So like what kind of like shift would that cause in this other country where you're pumping money into the lower people just have to get food and stuff, but that has to be backed with a resource. Where do those resources go?
Why does it, I'm not following. Why do we have to send gold?
It has to be backed by some type of resource. Like you can't just print off money and just send it over. Like that money has to actually.
Is the idea that dollars? Is the idea that dollars have to be that the worth of a dollar has to be backed up by some other resource value? Yeah. So that used.
So how it is now.
Right. So since the 1930s.
Then you become the resource. Like if you're working, then you're making money for a company. That becomes the resource that you're sending over.
So like throughout the 19th century into the early 20th century, that was the standard international law view, that money needed to be backed up by gold. And in the Bretton Woods, that was the Bretton Woods system that was got in the 30s. During the Great Depression, governments let that go. So now we live under what is called fiat money, which basically money is worth something because the government promises to make good on it. So it says, that's it. That's the whole story. So the government says we'll give you a dollar's worth if you come with a dollar bill, or a euro's worth if you come with a euro bill, and so on. Right? And so the money is worth that by us trusting it. So for better or worse, right? Like one of the benefits, or at least of it, was claimed to be that you could much easier. You have floating currency values, right? So you get markets in currencies where the strength of a currency reflects the underlying strength of the economy. That's the idea. So when an economy does badly, the currency goes down, and this usually this can dampen the downswing a little bit because exports become more competitive. Right? It's cheaper to buy. So the pound goes down, and it becomes cheaper for us to buy things from Britain because the dollar has gone up, so we can buy more with the same amount of dollars. Okay? And so if the economy of the UK goes down, the money goes down, we start buying more stuff, the economy you sort of slow the fall a little bit. And you couldn't do that before the system was let go, because every pound or every dollar has to be connected to a fixed amount of gold. So anyway, that's not the situation we live in anymore. So yeah, and you get things like quantitative easing. Right? Quantitative easing is just, let's print more money, and then we'll make good on it somehow. Trust us. That's the system. Right?
I think there is a solution to a lot of the objections that were brought up for a way in which you can give money. You can give it to the right people. You can make sure it gets in the hands of the right people. You can also make sure that they don't have a dependency on it, that they don't just, like if you feed a neighborhood cat, how it'll just come and, just want for that food, you can avoid that with the people, and that is you loan it, you make them pay it back, and loan it to people who, for reasons of starting a business, because that's what, historically speaking, look at any point in all of the history of mankind, that's what brings people out of poverty, is this capitalism. It's these
Yeah, so there's
principles.
there are lots of movements or experiments done with this. These micro lending type cases where you have websites where you can do this. You can lend even small amounts of money to people in the third world. Websites that will connect you with someone who says, "This is what I will do with it."
Really?
Yeah.
That's a
Just
genius
Google
idea.
micro lending. Yeah, you'll find them. And they'll see a picture and they'll tell you what the point is, and there will be a repayment plan. So.
One called Kiva, if you want to Google it.
I do.
K-I-V-A.
How about that?
Kiva?
And then you have like all these social entrepreneurs who just say, okay, I need money to, I don't know, get a sewing machine or something like that. I need some of this. And then they say, okay, I need $5,000, and if you just give them $5, that's already more than. So that's how they do it.
Right. Of course, that's in some ways not what Poggy's talking about, right? Because this is exactly the type of interpersonal stuff
I know, but
that
this
sidesteps
isn't
his
like
view.
giving the money. I mean, it's just.
Well, but there's
it's modifying it slightly, but it's under the same kind of idea.
Yeah, well, if you're going to make it institutional, so through this global economic order, so through international institutions and so on, the question is like, how do you make loans work in a way that doesn't run into the very problem he's flagging, which is the borrowing privilege, right? So right now, governments can take out loans. They say, yeah, we'll use it to invest in infrastructure and education and so on, and they rarely do.
Government,
Right, so-
is, unlike a person, doesn't have as much incentive. It's people spending other people's money, and they don't have
Yeah,
the same
sure.
incentives that individuals have.
So the question is then if there's a way that you can construct that system internationally that wouldn't have the same problems. So person-to-person lending might avoid these. The results are mixed, but some of them are good. Some of them are neutral. I don't know any bad results of that. But that's not what Poggy is proposing anyway.
I know, but it's the general idea slightly modified.
Well, slightly modified in the sense that you'd remove all of Poggy's theory and then put another one in its place. But yeah, because I mean the idea behind it is no longer there is this global order that is now harmful and that needs to be reformed into a different global order that contains this resource transfer. Right? That's the story he's telling. So once we start talking about person-to-person loans, you're sidestepping the whole economic and legal order. Anyway. All right. Anyone else? Yeah, tomorrow.
Maybe, like, with the borrowing principle, if they're not respecting human rights, then basically just,
Yeah, good. Yeah. So,
you do, like, it's a substantially low amount. Like, they can borrow, but it's going to be maybe at 10% of what they could get if they were to respect their rights, which in the end, they still make more money and their rights to be respected.
yeah, there's a philosopher at King's College in London who's called Leif Winar. And he's just published a book. I wanted to include it, but it came out too late for me to do so. But it's called Blood Oil. And he takes on this resource privilege idea. He basically says that blood oil is a thing, right? It's oil that we get from these countries where it's pretty clear that the fact that the presence of the oil is causing these civil wars and so on. And so his question is like, what do we do? Like we're buying in some way sense stolen goods, right? We're buying oil from countries where he says it's the people's oil, and the people aren't getting actually paid because it's the dictators that are getting paid. And so what do you do, right? So one of his solutions is, well, first you don't buy it, right? And then there's the further question, which is, well, but it's not quite as simple to say, well, we won't buy it because if we won't buy it, and China's still buying it by the billions of gallons, every year. So, and of course, that won't solve the problem, right? Because the country will still stay as poor. So then what do we do? He says, well, there is a certain price difference. Like say that we buy products from China, like plastic toys, right? So plastic toys, to make plastic, yeah, you need petroleum, right? So that involves oil. There's a certain price difference that we're getting, that if the Chinese also wouldn't buy that blood oil, they would have to pay a little more for the oil, right? That's why they're buying this. This is the cheaper oil. So there's a certain price difference, a couple of dollars, let's say it's $1 a toy or something, right? That the toy is now cheaper than it would otherwise be if it wasn't made with stolen goods. So what we need is a tax, he says, that for $1 per toy, or whatever the number is, right? $1 per toy, that's now that dollar cheaper. And we put that in a fund, and that fund is it's basically it's the Clean Hands Fund, he calls it. It's a good name. And so what that fund says is that once this country gets rid of the dictator and puts in place a democratic government, then the fund will become available to the democratic government to spend on its people. And so he thinks this flips the incentives around, right? Like, so right now we have incentives for people to be dictators because they sit on the oil. So in that case, if we don't buy it anymore and we tax and store it for once a good country comes, now the incentives are for the people to throw out these crooks and put a democratic government in place. Because once that's in place, this massive pot of money that's still growing, right, will become available to them, and they can actually do stuff with it. So that's pretty intriguing, I think, as an idea. His way of thinking about democratic is, like he says, basically what you need to have is you need to be in a situation where the people know what is being done with it. They can actually, like there's documents about to whom is it being sold and for how much that they can access, so some sort of freedom of information. And they must have an influence. They must be able to influence what is happening with it. So have some say in whether it gets sold and for what price. So there have to be some type of free and open elections going on. And if that's true, then the people are really selling the oil to whoever it is, and then the money will come available. So it's a variation on your thought, right? Like, so you make a condition on the oil being available, or the money for the oil being available to people. The condition being you actually have a stable and peaceful democratic society. So that would include human rights, but it would be more than that for him. Yeah. Same.
I have a question about both sides of this argument. What would make him right about us being responsible towards their problems, and what would make him wrong about concerning his argument?
I'm not sure. So what makes him right? Or
yeah, what makes him right? Depending on how you look at it. Some people think
I mean, the only answer that comes to mind is a really fishy.
okay, he's not right.
Is a not nice argument. I mean, I'd say like the facts, right? Like it's whether it's true or not. But,
and is it true?
Well, it depends on the facts, right? So how do we figure out the facts? Well, we do our best to try and look at them and see what's the case. So I mean, that you have to make up your own mind, right? So you have to wonder whether it is true that international law is harming people in the third world actively. And if that's true, then one part is established, right? That this global order is actually effectively harming people in the third world. And then for the redistributive proposal to come in place, you have to say, well, this international law order is actually harming the people. That was the first point. And second, we, as citizens of Western countries, are responsible for this in some way, such that we can be taxed. And that's a more moral claim, so now you have to think about the theory of responsibility or something, or what maybe elections may mean. So, can you, as a citizen, I'll give him his best shot, right? Let's think about reparations for slavery. Right? Do you think that Americans today owe black people reparations for slavery? If you think yes, right, here's probably the sort of story that you tell. Well, there was a massive injustice being done for generations and generations, right, by the government and the people who the government empowered. Right? But there were racist and racist laws. So how do we deal with that fact? Well, we say, well, the government today is responsible for that. But it's not just the people who are elected, right? It's the government, the institution. So the government institution has to pay for it. How does the government institution pay for it? Well, by taxing us. Right? So why is that justified? Well, because we are citizens of a society, are responsible jointly for what our government does. Something like that. That's the story, right? So I can be, well, yeah, I'm a bad example because I'm a foreigner, but anyway, like Kayla here can be taxed, right, to get reparations to be sent to you, not because she enslaved you, she didn't, right, but because she is a part of a society that together had a government that harmed your predecessors. I'm assuming that your parents were your forefathers, like whatever, right? Like your ancestors is the word I'm looking for, were harmed by this, or maybe you're still harmed by the results or something. Anyway, there's some way in which you are owed reparations, and because she's part of this collective, we can put that on her and everybody else, right? It's not just her. So if you buy that story, lots of people do, then we might say the same thing, right? Well, that's true for the domestic crime of slavery, but that's also going to be then true for international crimes, like the ones that Pogge claims are going on. So that cuts both ways, right? So if you accept it in the reparations case, then you should also accept it in Pogge's case. Or vice versa, if you want to reject it for Pogge, then either you have to give up your idea about slavery reparations or come up with some other story, right, that you can live with in both contexts. But yeah, so that's the kind of stuff it's going to depend on. Something about whether the causal story is telling is true is A, and B, whether you think you can be held liable for this. So it's not all good. You might get some reparation money, but then you have to pay some of it to the third world, right? So Kayla has to pay for just because it doesn't, she has to pay you. So, but you're a mixed account. All right. Two things before we move on. One is, you'll have noticed that I sometimes fall behind on our readings. Sometimes meaning regularly. I'll say, like last week, I had a conversation with someone about this. I think that person was slightly irritated by it. I'll tell you why I do things that I do. So, in part, maybe I'm just not very good at this. That's one reason. But the other reason is that it's a conscious decision. When we have conversations like the ones that we've been having over the last 10, 15 minutes, I try to give as much room as I can to those because I do think that's where most learning happens. There is a space for explanation and instruction, I guess is what I was doing. But also, when we really talk about things and we hear different people's viewpoints and ideas and questions that I wouldn't come up with, I think that's often the most valuable things, even if some of it might be boring to you or something. I think that's most important. So if that comes at the price of falling behind and something, then I think it's worth it. So, if you disagree, let me know. I'd like to hear it. So I was happy that this person brought it up. I have thick skin that way. But anyway, so that's one. Two, some bad news. We're switching on. Well, not bad news. It's good news. It's neutral news. I don't know. Bad news for me. Since I cannot live with having no grading to do on my desk, and we're moving on to our next thing. There was a pop quiz for Altman and Wellman, so we're going to do that now. I wanted to wait with that. So get a piece of paper, get a pen, put your name on the piece of paper, and answer these questions for me. Those were the questions for today. And remember, you don't have to write a lot, just a couple of sentences, just cut to the chase, right? That's what you should keep in, what your goals should be. Well, okay, then you're going to run out of time. You can choose to write only one answer, or you can cut to the chase and write 3.